right. Thank you, everyone. I guess I'm your penultimate speaker, which is a sad thing because it means that another CS3 is coming to a close. So before I even begin, thank you to Eric, Robert, and especially CC for putting on, as usual, a very wonderful show. This is definitely one of my favorite security events, and particularly within the ICS space. But without further ado, we're going to talk today about indicators versus anomalies versus behaviors. So before we get into that a little bit more, who am I? So I am a dedicated defender. My background is originally in the US Navy. After that, I was running the incident response team at Los Alamos National Laboratory. So like some other of your North American speakers have a little bit of a government background. However, now I'm doing things on my own terms because I'm currently a threat researcher at Dragos, where I'm taking that skill set into the private sector with a focus on the industrial control space. So what's the motivation for this talk? As we've emphasized multiple times today, we need to defend ICS networks. And unfortunately, while we can try and get rid of many vulnerabilities and difficulties, we're always going to have residuals. So how do we do it? There's lots of products, but there's really only a few fundamental techniques. So in order to evaluate what it is we need to do from a defensive standpoint, we need to evaluate the benefits and drawbacks of each. So our agenda today is we'll talk about indicators, and I'll try not to set that up as too much of a straw man. But then we'll actually dig into anomalies and behaviors as ways of evaluating detection and monitoring technology, talk about how we could evaluate each of these approaches in light of some actual examples, and move on to what implementation would look like for all of these techniques. So first, indicators of compromise are, in a formal sense, enriched descriptions of a potential compromise. They're designed to add some level of contextuality, and as a concept, there's a lot to be said in favor. So as an example of what an indicator of compromise looks in its ideal state, something as simple as this, where we have some nested logic, some and or statements, putting together a couple of observable items and saying when all of these conditions hold, this is indicative of compromise. That sounds kind of nice. The problem is that IOCs typically look like this. This report, this is the original Grizzly Step report. The second version is very good. I highly recommend people look at that report because a lot of the items from the original were cleaned up. But one of the problems was that from a defensive standpoint, individuals just receive this, a list of IPs, hashes, domains, etc. And nothing really communicates what's important about these, what these mean, what you should do about them. So what we've seen is much like in a medieval kingdom sense or whatever with the debasement of coinage, we've seen a debasement of the concept of an indicator of compromise. They're atomic, largely context-free, and consist, again, of those simple observables of hash, domain, file name, etc., which in isolation don't tell you much on their own. More so, every vendor, public entity, blog poster, etc., just wants to produce IOCs and call that as some meaningful production. Thus, we have IOCs everywhere. Well, reevaluating this in light of what we should be looking at, IOCs as implemented certainly leave a lot to be desired due to their lack of context and the fact that they're easily mutable in most cases. You can recompile software, you can change to another set of network infrastructure. But in theory, going to that original idea, there might be something to be said for it, so we should explore that a little more closely before we move on. The other more critical problem, though, is that IOCs, by virtue of definition, are backward-looking. They can be really good for forensics. They're really good against lazy adversaries, or if you can catch an infection and report on it in near real time. But they're terrible for detecting net new attacks just by definition. So even when we start getting into very complex nested statements of what an indicator of compromise looks like, including sufficient logic, this still relies on having previously identified this attack and the adversary sticking to fairly easily changed aspects of what that attack looks like. So by definition, you can't have an IOC for something that hasn't been identified already. It's an indicator of compromise based upon a past compromise. So by design, they're also intended to be specific with the result that they're brittle and they lack specificity as you start moving into permutations and variations of attack types. But enough about IOCs in general. What about for the ICS environment? Well, ICS is uniquely unsuited to IOCs in certain senses. We'll see with example later on in that we have a vast diversity of platforms, equipment, vendors, firmware revisions, etc. So a specific piece of malware designed for a specific make, model, revision of a device is going to look dramatically different from an implant or other piece of software designed to interact with a slight variation. As a result, IOCs from a given event are very specific to that target environment and may not really be very applicable elsewhere. So moving beyond IOCs, we need detection that's tuned to the needs of industrial control environments. They have to be flexible given the diversity of these environments, capable of detecting net new attacks. Based on what we've explored so far, IOCs are helpful for certain things, but as a single source approach, they're insufficient. So let's talk about anomalies. To address the net new problem, why just not look for new things? The concept is we establish a baseline, a concept of normal. We look for items that deviate from that baseline, and those deviations become items for analysis. That sounds logically quite simple and in theory quite effective. The benefit is that you'll definitely catch everything new. You'll robustly address the net new concern because any deviation from that normal will bubble up as an anomaly. Perhaps you can integrate some sort of machine learning or other algorithmic aspect into this so that in addition to just looking for new, you could try and define that to new but interesting or new in some other sense. Also, this relies on the own organization's data instead of past events for the baseline, depending. Ideally, you have a model trained on your own data, but depending on your vendor or your implementation, that may not necessarily be the case. But for all these benefits, there are drawbacks. So just because something's anomalous doesn't mean that something is suspicious, and more importantly, doesn't mean that that thing is malicious. That's a determination that has to be made by a human analyst. And like debased IOCs, anomalies lack context. When you identify an anomaly, you've identified that something's anomalous, something is new, something is different. But that tells you nothing about how that was oriented with respect to a potential attack, what that might mean from an adversary's perspective, and what you might need to investigate next. All of those steps have to be fleshed out by a human analyst and determined by that individual in order to add that additional context around the anomalous event. Furthermore, in order for this to work well, including in industrial control environments, that baseline requires constant adjustment and monitoring. And also you need to wonder, where did that baseline exactly come from? And is that necessarily representative of overall operations within the protected organization? Most importantly, though, from my personal experience dealing with this from a incident response environment, again, going back to the national labs, is alert fatigue. That it's really cool seeing that anytime you have an unknown or mysterious logon, the problem is, depending upon how that model is trained, you can very quickly end up with scores of anomalous events, each requiring an analyst to dig in quite deeply to process, disposition, and determine, is this actually something that is malicious, after which they've already spent a fair amount of time. Do that 100 times, and I can guarantee you that on the 101st time, you're putting in a little less effort than you were on the first. Furthermore, while machine learning could ideally make some sense of this, machine learning always kind of makes me nervous because it's that black box idea. So as XKCD let us know, like, yeah, we can keep feeding data at the problem and eventually we'll get a result that looks like what we want. But in that interim, how do you know why that result is being produced or what the meaning behind that is? Do you have confidence in what is being yielded is actually something that for what is being tossed aside is valuable? Ultimately, an anomaly means that something weird happens, so any use to that anomaly requires significant enrichment. The anomalous data point provides an initial point to investigation, but in many cases it's a weak one. I identified a new IP. I identified a new hash value. Maybe I have some contextuality based on what system that popped up on, but I still have to dig in and figure that out. Any of that correlation activity has to be done by the responding analyst. Now, in ICS environments, we often think that these are steady-state environments with fairly predictive activity. We generate power, we clean water, we produce widgets, etc. Plus, there's no end users doing things like watching YouTube or posting to Twitter or watching Twitch feeds and whatnot. So, there shouldn't be any of those dirty users dirtying up our data. And process and operations data should, as long as things are working right, stay within some sort of a narrow band which really facilitates coming up with a baseline. Yet, Are all ICS environments really all that predictive and stable? Is your feedstock consistent every single time? Is your power load, is the demands placed on your system equivalent all the time, including when adjusting for seasons and maybe even for time of day? I know the folks from the Nordic countries here are familiar with the rather hellish summer that you experienced this past year, which I'm sure was quite anomalous from a power demand perspective for a lot of the utilities. How would that have reacted if you were looking at how the processes or how the functioning processes within the ICS environment changed in reaction to those environmental factors? So additionally, what data is available for these models? Are you just capturing network data? If so, where is that network data captured from? Are you capturing all relevant links? And how does all of this filter into the model to come up with a useful picture that can be acted upon? And finally, does the model development, the actual algorithm itself, when you're talking about machine learning approaches, take into consideration some of the differences that we have between industry verticals, and even for that matter, individual companies within particular industrial environments? So even just looking at fairly broad brushstroke variations in behavior, we have changes based on time of day, changes based on season, etc. And while these can be baked into your model depending upon how you've gone about establishing a baseline before you turn on detection to keep something like this in play requires putting a device in your network and letting it run for months, a year, so that you actually capture all that variations in data. You could apply statistical techniques possibly in order to perform those manipulations and capture that variability, but then again, you're at the mercy of the model for how accurate that is to what you're applying in production networks. Furthermore, from a network perspective, networks themselves aren't necessarily always in a stable state. You could have engineers, if you're allowing remote access, which talking with some of our colleagues from yesterday on network segmentation, they disallow, which is awesome. But otherwise, in most cases, you have engineers, other workers, contractors coming in the network, logging onto things, making changes, etc. And that doesn't necessarily follow a pre-planned schedule because you have outages, you have equipment breaking down, or you have things that need to be done. And as a result, you could have day-to-day operations within the plant that rapidly become anomalous in origin. So when it comes to the idea of what sort of model is being applied, just how flexible is that towards the unique aspects and the nuance of the individual environment which is being monitored, or are we simply trying to have one ring to rule them all, so to speak, and a one-size-fits-all approach to how these anomalies bubble up as being items for investigation? So enough about anomalies. There's some things to be said for it, and then some very serious drawbacks that we need to be mindful of before we adopt that solution. The next and last methodology I'll speak to is behavior detection, or as I like to refer to it, threat behavior analytics. This is an intelligence-driven approach. It's based upon analysis of the adversary, what the attacker has to do in terms of goals and methods in order to achieve the objective of an intrusion event. It requires an understanding of the threat environment, and it also demands, as we saw going back to yesterday's keynote, mapping events to the kill chain, having that whole of attack approach to identify just what does each step, each stage of an intrusion look like, and how do we start building out detections and analysis based upon the dependencies between each step in that kill chain. So what we want to do is pursue adversary goals by looking at fundamental adversary actions to realize those goals. So examples include, malware self-propagation or lateral movement within an environment. An attacker needs to move to the targets of interest in order to have a desired effect. An adversary needs to hide sometimes using legitimate system commands. Well, how behaviorally does that look in practice, especially when you link that not just into single, like I had CMD exe run. Okay, that's an anomaly, perhaps. Well, I had CMD exe run, followed by PowerShell, followed by WMIC, followed by the creation of a new binary in app data local temp. Well, you chain all those together, that looks bad. That's probably something you need to investigate. And that's taking into the conception potential dropper survey and installation behaviors that can be used as a robust alerting point. So what we want to do is to design detections around the methods an adversary needs in order to achieve desired impacts. So what we want to do is articulate tactics, techniques, and procedures. I'm sorry for the acronyms. I am no longer in the US government in any way, shape, or form, yet they have obviously damaged me for life in some ways, so I use jargon still. But we want to identify those TTP aspects by looking at identified attack trends, map those to adversary behaviors, and then conclude by developing an ICS-centric, note I'm not saying just a general, but no, tuned specifically to the needs of ICS security, conception of how these TTPs would look, how they could be exercised in practice for an industrial-focused infection event. So from a behavioral detection standpoint, we're really looking at a tiered structure. At the top tier, we have the fundamental behaviors. These would be like your platonic forms or the behaviors in the ideal. I want malware to propagate. Well, then we have different applications of what that looks like. I can have wormable propagation. I can have propagation via net use or similar commands in the environment. And then you have the individual observables associated with that, the hash value of a specific wormable piece of malware, or the specific commands that are used in order to propagate throughout a network. And where we want to live is not at the specifics, because those will change. Not at the fundamentals, because you can't really see those. That's a notional idea. Instead, try and design detections by correlating events to look for those fundamental behaviors in application. So for behavior-based defense, we want to target that underlying adversary behavior, avoid relying on the specific instantiations, IOCs, and as a result, cover classes of attack instead of specific examples of any sort of attack. Implemented for defense, we would identify behaviors of interest. We would define a means to achieve the behavioral objective for the adversary. What is it that the attacker has to do for this to be successful? And then, most importantly, you would need to determine, well, what visibility do I need to actually capture this behavior and correlate it to get this sort of alerting technology? And then finally, once all that's done, begin building detections around the result. Now, in concept, that sounds simple enough, but may have some problems with it. We'll get into that. But the main thing is that in looking at this, we've now expanded from looking at any individual point along the ICS cyber kill chain to looking at events as they span across this, moving from initial reconnaissance in stage 1 all the way to potential stage 2 activity and different segments in between, organizing our defense in a way such that we are layering it on top of each other by looking at multiple stages in the attacker process. So you might not catch net new TTPs, for example, that new fancy malware or something like that may be so well designed that, yep, sorry, we just weren't thinking of that before today. But through kill chain coverage, you could identify other parts of the attacker lifecycle that haven't changed. Because I don't know about you, but I just generally assume that because I'm a lazy person, that other human beings are lazy people too. So while you might change one aspect of your operations, it's incredibly unlikely that you're going to completely reinvent the methodology behind launching a cyber attack, specifically one focused on ICS. So you want to play off of that attacker path dependency that maybe you don't identify the new piece of malware, but you identify command and control behavior. Not the specific IP, but just new executable ran in the operating environment followed by communication out to an IP address with no domain lookup. That's interesting. That's probably worth investigating. This isn't a perfect approach, though, and I'm the very first to admit this. Behavior tracking requires event correlation, and event correlation is hard and potentially very expensive in terms of processing power and storage requirements, especially in terms of real-time storage. Plus, you need extensive visibility between data sources. A lot of the examples I've cited so far include host-based events as part of their event correlation. It's not that many ICS environments, unfortunately, that are doing host-based data collection at this point, and that's a very big blind spot. So the most effective implementations in a lot of cases, based on how networks are laid out right now, may be out of reach. Furthermore, designing behavior-based defense is not easy. It's actually really tough. It requires a continued understanding of the adversaries and what sort of behaviors are in play for intrusion actions, and an ability to continue translating those behaviors into specific, reasonably specific TTPs around which detections can be built. The investment may simply be too much for organizations that don't have big security teams. If you already have one person who spends half of their full-time job doing security in your plant environment, they don't have time for this. Thus, this might not be actionable for them. So ultimately, threat behavior analytic detection, it sounds good, it's easy to say, and you see a number of entities that say some version of analytics or whatnot, but what do they really mean and how is this actually being implemented in practice? So for a case study, this has been mentioned a couple of times in previous talks already, but we'll look at the TRISIS Triton event. It's an excellent example to test these three approaches because it involved an ICS network penetration to a safety instrumented system and then deployment of a rootkit to that sys as a follow-on for the actual stage 2 phase of the attack. So from an overview in the initial intrusion, we saw a combination of custom scripts and binaries that were used, along with credential theft and VPN compromise in order to propagate through the target network. From an ICS specific attack standpoint, we saw continued use of credential theft and replay in order to move through the environment to get to the safety workstation, and then a custom attack payload deployed against the target device in order to yield the disruption that, thankfully didn't reach the final attack stage, but then resulted in an impact to the target plant facility. Now, from an indicator approach, unfortunately, this kind of fails outright, at least on some of the fundamental aspects. Because first off, TRISIS is unique malware. Based upon how this attack was designed, unless you were specifically running a Schneider Electric Triconics 3008 firmware version 3.2 to maybe 3.4 on the PowerPC processor, you're not vulnerable to this. So that specific malware isn't going to show its head again unless you are in that narrow targeting band of equipment and specific firmware type. So the hash and other values not only just didn't exist prior to the attack, but they're not very applicable outside of the attack either. However, we might be able to detect certain things like TTPs used in preliminary staging. And maybe if the adversary is sloppy, perhaps the C2 was reused. Oh, that's expressing a little too much faith and possibility for me to be very comfortable. So an indicator approach could catch reuse of TRISIS, but again, it's specific to that specific sys system. How relevant is that to your organization if you're not using that specific type of Triconix? And the payload itself, in addition, as you might see Nick Carr and myself argue on Twitter, can easily be obfuscated, pack it with UPX, change a couple of strings, and now all of a sudden your AV detections, your hash detections are broken. What do you do then? What about from an anomaly detection? Well, we can identify deviations from a baseline, and a safety system should have a very, very, very narrow baseline. Pretty much, it should either be doing nothing, or you have a safety situation, in which case it trips and it does its job. That's it. So baseline items could include interaction with the sys. Presumably, your engineers aren't playing with the safety system all that much once it's set up at initial plant installation. Could also look for remote logon and administration activity. And finally, as a last step, firmware upload to the sys. Although if you're detecting anomalies at that point, you've already ceded an awful lot of terrain to your adversary. So the sys-specific items will likely get caught. The problem is, are you actually capturing data on the link between your engineering workstation or your safety workstation and the safety system itself? Furthermore, depending upon your layout, is your sys system even really networked with the rest of your environment? In the case of the TRISIS attack, yes, it was. But do you have a tap sitting on the link between those devices, and are you actively capturing traffic to identify that behavior? And at that point anyway, you're alerting on the last chain of this attack. So you see the payload being delivered, which maybe facilitates your investigation, but again, you've already allowed an attack to take place, and we would really ideally like to be responding a little earlier on. The problem with the other items we identified, though, like remote logon activity, that the same issues that we identified earlier. It's like, yes, maybe you identified some interesting VPN use, but was your analyst able to or mature enough to differentiate that anomaly from the 50 false positives they've closed over the last 7 days? Maybe they are, but again, this is perhaps adding a little too much hope into the equation of trying to catch and deter a quite sophisticated attack. Now, from a behavioral aspect, first off, a behavioral aspect in certain respects absolutely fails. It fails because prior to this event, there's no such thing as a safety system attack. We didn't have an idea of that behavior up until the TRISIS event. It was theoretically discussed, but not really taken very seriously, unfortunately, by many in the security community. So there's nothing in the past to model. Now, firmware upload and interaction on that sys network might be caught, but that's also putting us in the same position as anomaly detection, where we're really in a case that monitoring might not exist, and you're detecting at the very last stage of a cyber-physical attack. So that final kill chain coverage is kind of lacking, and even where it's not an ideal place to be. But pre-safety system infection event, there's actually quite a bit of things that we can model here. So in many ways, the TRISIS event reflected a pretty standard intrusion. There wasn't all that much fancy or special about how this attack was executed in practice. So a behavioral mapping of fairly basic or at least fundamental aspects of an ICS intrusion would catch earlier kill chain stages such as propagation and lateral movement, authentication followed by execution of new or binaries in unusual locations, and thus focusing on that extended kill chain perspective gives us an idea to respond earlier to this potential attack. Now, as a drawback from a threat intelligence perspective, you may have never seen the SIS attack then, which kind of stinks because it's fun to see that, but we would have protected the plant environment, which is ultimately our main goal. So TRISIS identifies some advantages and shortcomings, but what about some more general ideas? So as a general example, credential reuse. We're all familiar with this one, and multiple adversaries that I track at Dragos. Electrum, responsible for crash override. Xenotime, responsible for TRISIS. Respite, responsible for activity in the Middle East and in North America. Allanite, responsible for some activity against the electric sector in the US and the United Kingdom. All of these adversaries use some variation of credential capture and credential replay to facilitate certain aspects of their kill chain coverage. Thus, this is a powerful, frequently used, but in many ways a difficult to track technique. From an IOC approach, again, by definition, you really can't identify credential reuse because there's not really an IOC around it. You may be able to identify tools associated with this if someone's using fairly stock password dumpers or keystroke loggers, yet it's painfully easy to obfuscate or otherwise, PE spin or take your guess or whatever for Mimikatz or other sorts of tools. Thus, and that's even when they're just run and available on disk. If you run something in memory by calling it through PowerShell as a long base64 string, do you even have detection on that in order to see it? Probably not, unfortunately, especially when it comes to your control system environment. From anomalies, from an anomaly detection perspective, this is really the standard use case that's often cited, at least in things that I've read and talking to individuals, for where detection based upon anomalous logons can win the day. This is theoretically powerful because logons at unusual times or new logons on a device should easily stick out above your baseline and formulate the initial stage for an investigation of likely malicious activity. The problem is, in catching those, how much noise are you actually filtering through on those other anomalies to get there? It's very much environmentally dependent, and it depends upon what normal is defined as within your environment. And there's two key issues here. So we've talked about the false positive rate already, that your analyst will have to close tens or hundreds of tickets before getting to something that's actually meaningful or useful. But there's also an important consideration of the false negative rate. So depending on how that model is trained, like maybe you already have an adversary in your environment when you set up your training session, or the adversary is just doing a reasonably good job of patterning after regular user behavior, your false negative rate can be concerningly high, or at least existent to the point that you're not going to detect the actual malicious behavior. From a behavior-based approach, credential theft detection depends upon compound alerting. No individual item in isolation is going to let you win the day against this sort of attack. So we wouldn't just alert on a new logon. That's an anomaly. We've talked about this already. But instead, we'd contextualize that as a behavior to provide a more robust approach. So we would look at this as being remote user logon activity, followed by process execution within an unusual part or in area of disk that's normally associated with drop malware, or perhaps PowerShell execution, followed by some other observable. And tying all those events together yields a fundamental behavior indicative of malicious activity. So in this sense, we're tying this to other suspicious items to build out a more fleshed out and robust detection that the analyst can take, disposition rather quickly, and initiate an investigation into a likely malicious event. Other ways of looking at this, besides those chained activities, if you're just looking at, say, event log data, is apply approaches of different patterns of credential use in the environment. A one-to-many approach. Single machine attempting to authenticate with a single set of credentials to many machines. I'm trying to see where I can get in based upon an infection. A many-to-one approach. I'm using many different credentials from a single machine to another single machine in the hopes that I'll be able to find some combination that'll get me access. Or many-to-many approaches, where I either have many machines, many credentials, many machines, single credentials, all trying to get to one or more devices of interest within the network. All of these start bubbling up in logging activity as long as you're not looking at a single logon event, but rather looking at logons over a period of time, say over a 15-minute window, and thus catching these sorts of combinations of events. Of course, the requirements to produce a high-confidence alert are you need a fair amount of data, which you might not have, and what capabilities do you have to actually correlate those in a fairly reasonable amount of time? You might have a central log stash that you can query, but what capabilities do you have to do a time-based search where you can combine all events matching certain criteria within a window in order to let that information yield itself from the data at hand? In a lot of environments, that's not possible, or at least it's very difficult. So this approach becomes fairly hard to execute in practice in many situations. All right, we've talked a lot about theory, and a little bit of practice with these examples. How do we move on from this? So in a perfect world, we do all three of these. That is the best answer. Each of these approaches has benefits that can be used in order to provide ideal security to your environment, and they interact with one another in such a fashion in order that their strengths offset each other's weaknesses. The different approaches complement each other and enable you to build a robust defense in depth capability. The problem is, and this has been brought up a couple of times at the event thus far, I am yet to identify an organization that has infinite time, resources, and personnel to actually implement all three practices at once. You're not buying 3 different Blinky boxes and an IOC feed, especially one that all of which are tailored specifically to the industrial environment. So as a result, you need to prioritize and choose what aligns best with your threat environment and with your needs from a detection standpoint, aligned to your threat landscape. The right decision really involves a lot of introspection, self-knowledge, self-exploration. You need to identify your organization's needs. What is it that our threat environment looks like? What is it that I need to do in order to ensure that I continue producing power, continue refining oil, continue producing widgets? What are the fundamental values at stake, and what adversaries are in play that can threaten those values? From that, what does my visibility look like related to those objectives? So can I see what current adversaries are doing? Do I have visibility on the pathways that lead to my crown jewel or critical assets within the environment? And then putting all of that together, then do I understand the threat landscape that I face in terms of both what is of value to me and what an adversary is trying to achieve, and the visibility necessary to then detect threats to the things that I care about? Based upon all of that, you might have a number of approaches that recommend themselves based upon the threats that you face more than others. So, wondering, or not wondering, but figuring out what your environment looks like and the visibility that you need is very critical. But it's also important to apply a time-based analysis to this of not just what have you seen in the past, what do you see right now, but what do you expect to come in the future? And that's where this exercise becomes not static. You do it once, buy a Blinky box, drop it in the sock or in the knock or wherever you're putting your Blinky boxes and walk away, but rather has to be an iterative approach where you do this periodically in order to continually refine your approach to the threats that you're facing to make sure that you're keeping up with what is putting you at risk. Now, from an IOC case, this is the easiest thing. You buy a feed and apply a simple white or black list. That's fine, except it's backward-looking and requires more complex data feeds to really get value out of this. So it might be good. Some cases, these are cheap, so it's not a bad idea to invest in anyway, just to, again, pick off lazy adversaries and fairly simple tradecraft, but it's not where we want to be. From an anomaly implementation standpoint, creating that baseline is the most important part. More importantly, is that a continuous or a static baseline? Are you continuing to refine your model based upon how your organization changes over time, assuming that you're not in a steady state, which I don't think you will be? And then determine what's anomalous. All deviations? Maybe not, because things happen. And depending on how often things happen, you might not be able to accurately or effectively disposition all those anomalous events, and you're burning out your SOC, you're burning out your security people in the process. Applying a statistic approach can be very interesting, but try to avoid the black box approach where you're wondering just what sort of black magic voodoo stuff is being created by the mysterious algorithm that no one can really explain because it spontaneously developed from machine learning and artificial intelligence. Ultimately, continuous learning is necessary to make sure that your model and your approach continues to map to how your environment is operating, as well as keeping pace with changes in that environment over time. Finally, from a behavior standpoint, you need to build an understanding of adversary techniques and map that to the kill chain. That's the first and foremost, and probably valuable in all these other approaches as well. But then you need to implement compound alerting around those behaviors in order to build out complex or non-atomic alerts around them. And finally, you need to revise those as tactics, techniques, and procedures change over time. A static model is simply not going to cut it as adversaries adapt to what's going on and introduce new tradecraft. This has the highest upfront cost, but the greatest potential longevity because, again, targeting those fundamental behaviors means that you're targeting things that are not immutable, but certainly don't change as often as individual sample hashes or individual C2 IPs. There we go. But again, the ideal solution is don't do just one, do at least two. Combine as many of these approaches as possible. What's interesting to note, though, is that a behavior-based approach really, on its basis, combines multiple approaches to begin with. You can incorporate anomalies into a behavior-based approach as one item building into a more contextual alert. So I see a new IP address. Well, what do I relate that to otherwise? Do I relate that to new program execution or new user logon or other sorts of items in order to then build out a contextual alert around the single anomaly? That's actually not a bad idea. In this case, we're striving towards a behavior-based defense with a robust backing behind it with the greatest potential benefits. So really what we're trying to do is develop defense in depth. We want to identify, even among all of these approaches, some understanding of common requirements for our environment from a security perspective and the behaviors that are used in order to, for an attacker to execute objectives on target. And from that, build out detection and visibility on the implications of those behaviors and how it is that the adversaries are going to operate, what it is that they can do in order to hold things that you value at risk. And then finally, implement alerts and responses around this, but just make sure that you're doing so in a sane way. I've been in environments where I've been instructed that we need to alert on every instance of event X happening. Well, if event X is a SQL injection scan of public-facing web servers, you're going to have some very unhappy people, and that's in an IT realm. Similarly, if you were to develop a alert or detection on, I want an alert every time RPMs on this turbine fall outside of a 3% or whatever threshold of normal, whatever normal is. Well, depending on your environment and what's going on, you're either, creating something out there that's very well tuned to the process in question, or you're setting yourself up for grief if there's something that would cause fairly consistent variability in how that physical process functions. So knowing exactly how this relates to your environment, what the implications are, and designing defense around that is vital to get something that's actionable and sustainable over time. Ultimately, behind all of this, defense really is not just doable, as my CEO, Rob Lee, would say, but it has the advantage, in my opinion. Because in all of these approaches, except maybe the IOC-based approach, that the attacker has multiple gates to pass through in order to achieve success. Unless you get into a situation of an insider threat or someone has broken through the fence and plugged in a USB stick, an attacker has to succeed in an initial IT intrusion, pivot into the ICS environment through some mechanism, persist within that environment while retaining control over tools or a system, move into the ICS environment to survey what systems are available, what protocols are running, what attack surface is exposed, develop and deliver a payload against that attack surface, and finally trigger it. At every one of those stages, we have a potential touch point or detection point that we can hold the attacker to a disadvantage on. It's a step that they can screw up, that they can make a mistake on, or at least show us some element of what they're doing around which we can build defense, identify them, and kick them out. Hopefully, around here and not around there. But even still, if you're not detecting something until the very end, at the very least, it was brought up yesterday that, we're blaming cyber first, or was it cyber before asking, was it, something broke? We could at least facilitate answering that question because we've built up detections and visibility around what's needed in order to satisfactorily resolve that issue. So that's all I have really from an interactive, well, this isn't interactive, but from a static standpoint for me talking to you. A few references when these slides are made available. I'll figure that out if there's something with CS3 or post them on SlideShare, but just some different references for background on IOCs, anomaly approaches, as well as some material like the 4 types of threat detection white paper that we just put out a few months ago at Dragos, but just additional background on any of these techniques for your own edification and exploring these concepts and how they relate and are applicable to your own environment. So with that, I'm done with a little bit of time to spare, plus time for Q&A. Certainly feel free to contact me or tweet at me or whatever floats your boat or catch me in the halls here. And with that...
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
And here's a gift for you too.
Thank you very much.
There you go. And a few questions, of course. Like who's calling? No, here we go. Are there really effective behavioral analysis tools?
Single tools? I would honestly say no. I mean, that's probably one of the issues behind there being more than one snake oil behavioral anomaly development project. I mean, the issue is that thinking that it's almost like any sort of single tool. would be a tool of tools, a correlation engine between multiple sensors that takes the various data sources and just sorts them and identifies what the underlying trend or pattern would be. So from the traditional sense of I drop a box in your environment and it does things, no, there's not a tool like that. Drop a box that takes in information from a bunch of other endpoints or a bunch of other items and then puts that information together to yield behavioral-based activity? Yes, there are actually options there.
All right. Do you have such tools that can train your models in real time?
I don't personally have tools. That's a good question. I'm not a machine learning or anomaly detection expert. I'm aware of how it works at a high level. I would recommend just the way that a lot of approaches are designed is that you set up with an initial 30-day, 60-day training window, and then it just seems in many implementations that the window closes at that point, which seems misguided in my opinion. So training in real time is probably too costly, but at the very least, setting up in background continuous training windows allows for adaptability over time.
Yeah, okay. In what ways threat hunting and adversarial TTP assessment help attack technical attribution in the context of ICS and SCADA?
Simple. You have an idea of what's actually possible, what's relevant, what's going on. So this came up in the keynote yesterday to a certain extent and in some subsequent talks. But for example, how many 0 days have been utilized in order to compromise an ICS or SCADA environment? We've had a couple that have been used, but fundamentally, most of the time, most of the disruptive attacks, you either had a person on keyboard or VNC'd to a workstation simply turning something off, or someone designing malware that does basically that activity. So knowing that and thus prioritizing, like, well, the behavior I should be looking for aren't exploits flying throughout my network or even necessarily custom malware, but just someone able to authenticate in and get to a point where they can control devices on their own and taking advantage of how they work in order to turn them off or put them in an unstable state. Knowing that lets you start training what you need to do from a detection standpoint, what behaviors are fundamental to doing that, and then build defense around what's actually going on.
But let's take the Ukraine, for example.
Yes.
The remote access, when they dialed in, they used valid credentials.
Yes.
But maybe they dialed in during a time where there shouldn't be any dialings?
Yep, so that is also possible. So that's like the easy win anomaly detection. Like, why is Sergey logging in at 1 in the morning or whatever from not Sergey's house and not the actual plant? That's easy. I know that that's malicious.
Sure.
When you have a robust attacker, though, especially those that work on shifts that align to their target's work days, that's harder to figure out. So again, it's staging those so that, yeah, it's good to pick out those sort of low-hanging fruit or easily spotted anomalies, but when you start getting into some of the more messy cases, like is your visibility robust enough to differentiate between, nope, Sergey's just working too hard, and no, this is not Sergey, something else is going on here.
Right. So what data sources are used for behavior tracking and analysis?
So 3 fundamental data sources from an ICS perspective, and this is where the behavior-based approach, I think, really shows its value. So network data, which all approaches use in one form or another, but then combine that with host-based data. So I want to see what's going on over the wire, but I want to see what processes are executing, what files might be being written, depending on what your capacity is to store that information, things like PowerShell execution in Windows environments. But then also, and most importantly, well, maybe not equally important from a industrial standpoint, am I getting data from the historian and correlating that with other events as well? Process data so that I can relate what I'm seeing on the network on host along with what's going on with operations to get a complete picture of just how is my plant performing right now as a mechanism to identifying potential threat activity.
Would it be possible to combine the profiling with the whitelisting, for example? If you whitelist applications, and do you have to monitor them in any way? I mean, if you lock them down, if you wish,
right.
So only a certain executable can...
That's very possible. And again, this goes to the approach that if you have a perfectly locked down environment, no one is allowed to remotely authenticate in, you have strict application whitelisting enforced across the network with robust 2-factor authentication needed in order to do any sort of administrative activity. A lot of this is going to be really easy, in which case even a simple anomaly detection profile might be applicable. The problem is there's not that many environments that are there yet.
No. Yeah. But maybe we should still promote minimization and attack surface.
Yeah, no, I agree. This goes towards the idea of having a robust response to threats across the spectrum. Build up greater resiliency and security hygiene. Some people don't like that term. And then follow that up with closing those gaps or those residuals that are left over following the controls you've put in place.
All right. Is there enough historical threat analysis data available for ICS SCADA attacks to attribute them to an actor based on identified TTPs?
Yes and no. So
wow.
whoever asked that question should have attended my class earlier this week. But looking at the ICS threat environment, we've really only identified a handful of actual attacks. So that's a very small sample size, which makes things difficult. But if you look at the fundamental tradecraft under supporting those ICS attacks, they map rather well to standard IT intrusion tradecraft. So paying attention to what's going on for IT intrusions gives us an identification, at least earlier in the kill chain. Well, what would I expect in the run-up to a stage 2 ICS attack development? So I can build, I might not know what specific piece of malware might come down the line for a ICS-specific attack, but I can catch it when it's being deployed in my environment. I can catch the adversary pre-positioning to deliver that impact, and I can identify when they are communicating back and forth to retain control.
Right. Thank you. So how sensitive is the behavioral approach to false flagging?
Honestly, from a behavior-based approach, it shouldn't matter. Like false flagging, like, okay, this is Ecuador or CNE instead of Serbian computer network operations. Fundamentally, I don't care because they're still in my industrial environment and I want to kick them out. Now, if I'm the US government or NATO, maybe I care, but they're not defending our plants, so they can do that work on their own and we can focus on defending our industrial environments in the meantime.
Fair enough. So why the attacker has to go through the business IT network and not by abusing the direct vendor access to the environment?
That is a tricky question. So this does come up, and that is a hard one to answer because you've already sort of ceded some of your perimeter to someone that you have to trust and hope that they're doing a good job. In those cases, recommendations, depending upon the installation, segment those off in their own parts of the network and layer in some detections around that so you don't catch the initial dial-in necessarily, but you do catch the movement away from the vendor machine to other parts of the network. The counterexample was raised when I brought this up a few days ago. Well, I have a few thousands of these. What do I do then? Like, well, you can try and virtually segment all of these with a VLAN or other sorts of approaches to build in that layered defense in depth around those sort of backdoor access points into the network.
All right. So one last question. Do you use the Mitra attack, TTP framework in your work?
So we've been looking at it, actually. So I work at Dragos. We've talked with MITRE about their ICS attack framework. Those conversations probably haven't been as productive as they should be. There's a lot more scope for collaboration there, but it definitely informs some of what we do. And it's a very good approach for modeling, especially from the stage 1 IT-centric intrusion methodology, what sort of behaviors map up. So like Katie Nichols and her crew at MITRE are really excellent people, and I'm a big fan of the work they're doing.
All right. Thank you very much. That was the last question. Thank you.